Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and welcome to today's America Walks webinar, How to Take on Harmful Jaywalking Laws. I am Kelsey Card, Communications Manager at America Walks, and I'm joined here today by Charles T. Brown, founder and principal of Equitable Cities, a minority and veteran-owned urban planning, public policy, and research firm focused at the intersection of transportation, health, and equity. Charles will be your host and moderator today, and I will be running the technical details behind the scenes here. So before we get started, I just want to thank our sponsors today, including the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, for making these great events possible for us here at America Walks. And of course, to all of you who attend our webinars regularly and even have donated to make sure this program and our other programs continue to thrive. Thank you so much. These programs allow us to directly support local grassroots activism and education, along with making an impact on issues at the federal level as well. So if you do like this content and you're a regular guest here, please consider making a donation towards our webinars and this important work. I have a quick note about the technology. So you should see a control panel like this on your screen. It's that question box near the bottom of the panel, and that is where we'll be looking for your questions for our panelists today. So after presentations, we'll kick off a good little Q&A session. So please enter any questions that come to mind during the presentations right there. And if you'd like to use our closed captioning today, you'll see a link in the chat box. So we have three amazing presenters today who have all been working diligently around this timely issue. Michael Kelly leads Bike Walk KC's efforts to advocate for the policies, plans, and projects which will support a culture of active living in the Kansas City region and beyond. He has successfully advanced a number of initiatives, including Complete Streets ordinances, Vision Zero legislation, and the decriminalization of walking and biking in Kansas City, Missouri. Karo Jauregui is an active transportation professional and mobility justice advocate who has dedicated herself to pedestrian safety through her great work with California Walks, serving as co-executive director and in her community of unincorporated West Whittier in Los Angeles County. Councilmember Isaiah Thomas is a freshman at large council member serving on Philadelphia City Council. He serves as chair of the Streets Committee and vice chair of the Children and Youth Committee. Councilmember Thomas is working on the issue of hit and runs to make streets there safer and more equitable. So today's webinar will highlight the work being done at both the state and local level to decriminalize jaywalking and some of the ways that you can best invest in these issues within your community and why this issue is vitally important to achieving mobility justice in our work. So thank you so much to all of you for being here. I'm going to turn things over to Charles now for a quick introduction, and Michael will kick off our presentations.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kelsey. Thank you, Mike, and to the entire board at America Walks, people that I consider family. Welcome, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm excited to discuss and facilitate a conversation on how to address harmful jaywalking laws with my esteemed panelists. In order to help contextualize this conversation, I'd like to remind you of the 9 reasons why we must eliminate jaywalking laws, as per a recent article by Angie Smith and I. First, jaywalking is a made-up thing by automotive companies to deflect blame when drivers hit pedestrians. Secondly, the concept of jaywalking encourages drivers to be aggressive towards pedestrians and for third parties to ignore or excuse pedestrian deaths. Thirdly, our streets are not designed to make walking safe or convenient. Fourth, pedestrians are almost as likely to be struck and killed at an intersection as mid-block. Fifth, when pedestrians jaywalk, they are often behaving rationally. As I often say, if a pedestrian, bicyclist, or other vulnerable users say the environment made me do it, please believe them. 6, jaywalking laws are not enforced fairly. Should I say more? 7, jaywalking laws or jaywalking stops are frequently explosive. I don't think I need to say more there neither. 8, The focus of jaywalking reflects the lower political status of those who walk, not the societal harm of the activity. And then lastly, the safest countries globally allow jaywalking. I would now like to turn things over to Mike to kick things off. Mike?
Uh, Thank you. And I will show my screen here. Give me just a sec. Okay. So again, my name is Michael Kelly, and I'm the policy director for Bike Walk KC. And I'm going to kick off our discussion by giving everyone a overview of our efforts to decriminalize walking and biking in KC-Mo. So this presentation really quickly seeks to answer three questions. Why does decriminalization matter? What role did Bike Walk KC play? And finally, where do we go from here? So to begin, the first question we need to answer is, why does decriminalization matter? And why should we care about what happened in Kansas City? There are three main reasons as to why our work is relevant to advocates and communities elsewhere. First, our work is in line with what other advocates have been calling for and beginning to accomplish elsewhere. That includes vocal proponents for a shift away from enforcement, like Dr. Brown and Angie Schmidt. It also includes following the examples set by places like Virginia, which decriminalized jaywalking in January of this year. Kansas City, Missouri, being one of the largest cities to accomplish this thus far, creates an example for others to follow. Additionally, it's important to understand that tickets for jaywalking can be a gateway to not only physical harm, but financial harm as well. On the other side of Missouri, a federal investigation following the death of Michael Brown found that the city of Ferguson collected over $2.4 million in fines and court fees in 2013 alone, often from low-level offenses like jaywalking. The initial ticket, coupled with additional fines and fees, often created something many folks struggle to emerge from. And finally, and at the most fundamental level, we all have an obligation to push for this change as educators and advocates for active transportation. Building infrastructure and knowing the rules of the road are important, but those elements alone don't go far enough to make our streets safe for Black and brown pedestrians and cyclists. We have an obligation to break down these additional barriers to create a built environment which is truly safe for everyone. So once we decided that this was the right course of action, our first challenge was to figure out how we needed to define decriminalization within this context. So we created a list of terms, searched for statutes related to those terms, and then identified the statutes to target using two criteria. So the first criteria was seeing whether a statute failed to meet the criteria of, can it be equitably enforced? Acknowledging that there is likely an argument to be made that more than 3 statutes in the municipal code are not enforced equitably, we focused on the language of the statute itself to make this determination, and ultimately identified those portions of the municipal code that in no way, shape, or form could reasonably be expected to be enforced equitably. The second criteria was seeing whether a statute failed to meet the criteria of, does it make streets safer? Safety, especially in the context of protecting Black and brown road users, is not a universally agreed upon term as it relates to its definition. In this case, we looked at the numbers and trends of crashes, injuries, and fatalities and asked, is there any reasonable way we can argue that these laws are helping to lower these numbers? The answer with each of the measures we identified was no. While there were a number of laws we identified that likely need a closer look and clarification, there were 3 statutes in particular which we found failed the 2 criteria and opened the door to over-policing. Dirty wheels, bicycle inspections by the police, and of course, jaywalking. So once we knew what exactly it was that we wanted to decriminalize, our next challenge was figuring out how to make the case that decriminalization mattered and that it was something which needed to happen now. To accomplish this, we took 3 broad steps. First, our first order of business was to build a coalition of support for decriminalization. In terms of who we targeted, we reached out to individuals and organizations from a variety of backgrounds in Kansas City, including health foundations, tenants' rights organizations, a children's health coalition, neighborhood leaders, biking and walking groups, and even a board member of ours who works as an attorney. For many of them, our request was twofold. First, write a letter or submit testimony for decriminalization, and two, urge your partners and followers to do the same. So beyond the folks that we knew, we also wanted to make the issue prominent in the public eye. We started with presentations on the subject where we invited the public to listen in, but our staff also sat on panels and spoke with members of local media to bring attention to the issue as well. We used these instances to ask folks if they were comfortable to share their stories of over-policing to further bolster the argument we were making. And finally, with showing the data, this took the longest to accomplish, but ultimately may have been the element which helped to push decriminalization over the top. So for those of you who may not know, Kansas City does not have local control of our police department, which means that police aren't always willing or required to hand over information which can benefit the public. Thankfully, Councilwoman Melissa Robinson was able to push for the release of data on jaywalking tickets. That data revealed that of tickets given out over the last 3 years, 65% went to Black pedestrians, despite the fact that we make up less than 30% of the city's population. As a result of all of this, the City Council voted unanimously to strike jaywalking and bicycle inspections from the municipal code and significantly modify the dirty wheels section in May of 2021. So while we are proud of the work our coalition has accomplished, there is more work to do. In particular, Bike Walk KC is looking to take the following next steps. First, repealing jaywalking and bike inspections and modifying dirty wheels was important, but it's not the only place where we think there's room for improvement in Kansas City. We want this effort to be part of a broader push to reduce traffic enforcement tactics and policies which put Black and brown people at risk, physical or otherwise. We're beginning to evaluate parking enforcement and looking at ways that this can be modified and handled by an entity other than the Kansas City Police Department. It's also important to recognize that Kansas City, Missouri isn't the only place where this sort of legislative push is necessary. After all, we're part of a 2-state, 9-county region with well over 100 separate local entities. While we can't tackle all of those at once, we can focus on the larger places first. And with that in mind, we're beginning to research the municipal code of the largest set of communities after KCMO to see which places are in need of decriminalization as well. Finally, we recognize that our efforts are part of a broader conversation and concerted effort happening across the country, and we want to do our part to help advocates, community stakeholders, and others make this necessary push to decriminalize walking and biking. That's why we are partnering with the National Safe Routes Partnership to develop a guide on decriminalization, which will document our process and share lessons learned. We hope to publish this guide sometime late this year or early in 2022. With that, I want to thank you for being here today, listening to my remarks, and I will stop sharing my screen and pass the baton to Caro.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay.
We can.
Okay, thank you. All right. So in California, the organizations that worked on decriminalizing jaywalking, we have our logos here, most of them. I think you should be able to see LA Walks' logo as well. I know that I can't on my end, but it's there. So the organizations who worked on this were CalBike, California Walks, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights of San Francisco, and alley walks. And this image basically, I think, became one of our main logos throughout our campaign, and this was put forth through CalBike. So in California, the bill that we worked on was a bill that would change the California vehicle code, because jaywalking, and I don't know how it is in other states, is an official definition in the California vehicle code. So for us, that bill ended up being Assembly Bill 1238, which at times was called officially the Freedom to Walk Act or the Safe Streets Crossing Bill. What I wanted to say, and I'm already looking at some of the questions in the chat, is that after I'm done presenting, one of the links that I will share is a link that shares the actual language of the bill, and that's through the California State Legislature that shows how the language was amended throughout, in the hopes that that's helpful to you all, so you can actually read that language. What I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to go through the first two sections, I hope fast, because I want to get into the other stuff more. So I'm going to talk about how AB 1238 happened. I want to talk about the California legislative process. I want to talk about what we did, what was our approach, what are some of the lessons learned, and some of our next steps. So the birth of AB 1238. I think it's important to note that we were inspired here in California by the article that Charles shared, and that was actually one of the things that I was going to put in the link, because I think that article highlights a lot of really important information, and we were also able to get some of that very specific data outlined in that article for California. And there's a second article that I will share in the chat afterwards as well, that was sort of a, again, type of inspiration for why it was very clear that we needed to work on this and put this forth. So initially, the folks who did that work, though, were our partners CalBike, and they shopped around the idea of the bill to both various members of the state legislature and with advocates such as California Walks. Basically, I was outreached, hey, if we did this, would you join us? And I, of course, said yes. Ultimately, I think I said this already, but ultimately the legislator who authored the bill and carried the bill, like that's the language they use, is Assemblymember Ting of San Francisco. There were also other co-authors, and within the assembly, the co-authors ended up being Assemblymember Laura Friedman, who's actually the chair of the Assembly Transportation Committee, and Assemblymember Lorena Gonzalez signed on as a co-author, and she is the chair of the Assembly Appropriations Committee. And I'll share more in this next slide why that's important and relevant. So I wanted to be sure, to share with all of you that even though this maybe might be obvious, the state legislature has a calendar that we have to abide by. Like, I unfortunately had nothing to do with coming up with any of these dates. And so in terms of like the when, this was by when we had to get things done. So I'm just gonna read it. I know it's a lot, but I think it's important because hopefully some important things will come out as I read through it. So a bill, per the state legislature calendar, a bill needed to be introduced by February 19th, which is what was done. The actual language wasn't actually due until a few weeks later, but there was a spot for the bill by February 19th. And then the next sort of big deadline is the bill must pass its House of Origin by June 4th. What does that mean? In California, we have the state assembly and we have the state senate. So meaning that the bill, since it's an assembly bill, needed to pass the full assembly floor by June 4th. In the process, it was assigned to 2 committees. And it passed those 2 committees, and those committees were the Assembly Transportation Committee and the Appropriations Committee, which, as I mentioned, the chairs of those committees chose to really support this bill in a big way, which was really important. So then the next big deadline, once the bill passed the Assembly, was that it needed to pass out of the Senate by September 10th. I'll share this more in the next slides, but once the bill got into the Senate, I think everything was just so much more intense and so much more stressful, to the point that we really didn't think it was going to make it out of the Senate Transportation Committee, much less the Appropriations Committee, and much less out of the Senate floor, which it actually did make it out of the Senate floor by the deadline, by September 8th. And then the next big deadline was that a bill must be signed or vetoed by the governor by Sunday. I don't know why it's Sunday. The deadline was October 10th. And ultimately, Governor Newsom did veto this bill, and he vetoed it in the afternoon of last Friday. So it's been a week. So that was a lot, but I thought that was important to share. In terms of our approach, I'm trying to be helpful. And the way I was thinking about it was that there was this very clear need for an infrastructure from the core team. And then we also had this organizing strategy. So in terms of infrastructure, initially Cal BIPOC and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights of San Francisco and the Authors Office worked a lot on the bill. Cal BIPOC also was able to develop a landing page, which I will share that link, and some of the initial messaging. As I shared in the beginning, they were kind enough to come up with the logo and some of that language. I think that eventually our team had more synergy right around the summer, and I suspect it also had to do more with the fact that that's when I think things got a lot harder once the bill made it into the Senate. So having infrastructure, basic things like a landing page and messaging, I think is a must that I would not have known to do. So I'm grateful that other partners knew to do that. In terms of the organizing strategy, we did have a statewide coalition. Initially, we had meetings, and then folks dropped off from attending meetings. They didn't stop supporting the bill, but we just didn't have that initial momentum, I think, for various reasons, including that I think 2021 just ended up being very difficult, similar to, 2020. We also, right around the time that the bill made it to the Senate, a main strategy ended up being directly targeting the legislators who sat on those committees or who were the chair of those committees, so that we could specifically challenge the rhetoric of the opposition, which was mainly law enforcement. After the bill passed both houses, then the next thing we really focused on was on op-eds. There were a couple of radio interviews, podcast interviews, I believe, that John from LA Walks did recently. We had a meeting with the governor's office. We did a Twitter town hall. So that was a lot of what we did. I think in terms of the lessons learned, I just want to preface this by saying that this is from California Walks. I can't speak for the rest of our partners. because we actually haven't processed together. As I said, we really just found out late on Friday, so it's been a whole week and it's been hard. So I think the first thing that I'd like to share is make sure that you understand what you are getting into and you say yes to running a bill. I don't regret it in any way, but at the time, California Walks, much like the rest of the world, was going through a lot of transitions. I became a co-executive director a year ago, October 9th. So I didn't fully have a grasp of a lot of the things within the organization, and much less, I didn't know anything about the legislative process. So I think that, again, I know that's probably very basic, but if I could share one other thing, in addition to time, I think being aware of how much emotional work this is going to take from you. I think as people, as a person of color, this was very triggering, to be really, really honest, this entire process. So I think just making sure that you're aware of that. I think another lesson learned would be that I wish we would have elevated survivor stories a little bit more. To be clear, survivor stories in terms of people who did get a jaywalking ticket, they did speak in the state legislature along the way. So there was some of that, but one thing that I wish we would have done more was when we, in our organizing efforts, we shared a lot of the data, which you would hope that would be enough in terms of the unequal enforcement towards Black people in the state. And I also think that we should have elevated those stories a bit more, and not just shared the numbers. I think the last thing I said, I wrote down, because I can't see it because my little box is here, was don't settle and don't let other people's limitations become your limitations. And I think this is really, for California, this was a really big thing because our governor was going through a recall election. So I think throughout the process, we were also told at times, like, don't be too hard on him, don't call him out too much, which anyways. So just make sure that you always stay true to yourself, and make sure again that those limitations that other people have and that the system has and that the Democratic Party has don't apply to you. The next step is, again, this video just happened a week ago. We've been outreached to by the author's office, Assemblymember Ting, that the administration wants to work with us. I don't know what that means, and I haven't responded to them yet, because again, our core team of Cal Bike, California Walks, the Lawyers Committee, and LA Walks, we still haven't even processed together, and I want to make sure that we get a chance to figure that out. Can someone tell me how much more time I have, because I wanted to read our official response to
1 minute.
I have 1 minute? Great.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I'm going to read some of our official response that we just sent out yesterday. We've been a little quiet over here because I needed to get myself together. In his veto letter, the governor uses an incomplete and biased data source to claim that removing jaywalking laws would actually hurt pedestrians, because over half of the pedestrian fatalities were the result of pedestrians taking action against a traffic control system. This public data source is called Switters in California and is inherently biased because it only captures police reported data. Individual police officers are given full discretion to determine the primary crash factor based on car-centric laws that too often blame pedestrians and bicyclists for the lack of adequate infrastructure. Blaming individual people for the lack of infrastructure in their communities is both racist and classist, especially because it is well documented that Black, Indigenous communities of color have the worst infrastructure across the state and the entire country. The governor's veto of AB 1238 is a grave injustice and demonstrates his complicitness in state-imposed violence toward all pedestrians, but especially the Black community who's often stopped by law enforcement for jaywalking. It is unacceptable to both use biased data gathered by law enforcement to veto a bill that would protect our most vulnerable road users, while also not holding law enforcement accountable for the unequal enforcement of jaywalking laws. While the governor expresses commitment to working towards reducing excessive force and bias, in his letter, he does not explicitly state by when or how. When given an opportunity to stand with pedestrian safety experts and the 90+ organizations who supported this bill, Governor Newsom chose not to. So thank you. I'd like to now pass it on to Council Member Isaiah Thomas.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm not as sophisticated as these other folks, so unfortunately, I don't have a PowerPoint to make folks feel good. I'll go off screen, but that's the best I can essentially do. My name is Council Member Isaiah Thomas. I am a council member at large in the city of Philadelphia. I am one of the 7 at-large members of City Council, so I represent the entire city of Philadelphia. Today, I have the opportunity to take a few minutes to talk about my driving equality bill, which actually passed out of City Council yesterday, and it's something that we're extremely proud of. So I'm not going to be too long. I know that there were 2 great presentations before me. I'm assuming there's some things that's supposed to happen after, so I'll give a brief timeline of what took place as it relates to the creation of the legislation to the passing of the legislation yesterday. I think it starts with the problem and the data. When you look at the Bailey consent decree and the federal civil rights cases that's been involved with both car stops as well as pedestrian stops in the city of Philadelphia, it's something that our office was extremely concerned about. It's something that I talked about on the campaign trail, and it's something that I have the pleasure of trying to work on. And this was something that was on my radar prior to a George Floyd or for us in the city of Philadelphia, Walter Wallace type situation. I also have my own lived experiences as well. I've written a number of opinionated editorials that talks about my experiences driving and being discriminated against growing up here in the city of Philadelphia. So once sworn in, we immediately got to work, and we tried to figure out what can we do to address this issue of stop and frisk in the city of Philadelphia. We talked to a number of different legal partners, including the city solicitor's office, the public defender's office, as well as the district attorney's office and other stakeholders and partners. And we came up with this concept that instead of trying to have direct impact on the actual motor vehicle laws, we can have some level of impact on the implementation of the law and how we implement and enforce those laws here in Philadelphia City, in our municipality, in our county as well. And that's significant with this because motor vehicle code violations are state law, and we are our own county. And so about a year and a half ago, we introduced our original legislation that came into council with 9 co-sponsors that talked about how we can reclassify minor traffic violations and look at traffic violations that do not impact public safety, but are often used as tools to discriminate against certain demographics. Look at how we can change those traffic violations from primary reasons to for primary violation, which means the officer will have to pull you over, to a secondary violation, which means that you would commit another infraction, and if that infraction too was an issue, you would then be fined, or there would be some level of enforcement. And so, for example, currently, before my law is even implemented, seatbelts would be in that category right now. Seatbelts is an example of something whereas though you can be pulled over for speeding or running a stop sign, and if your seatbelt also isn't on, that motor vehicle code violation would be enforced. We looked at 7 different categories that we changed from that primary reason of being pulled over to secondary levels of enforcement as far as how the police would be looking at the primary means of enforcement. And we got there by basically building a team. After we introduced the original legislation, we went to the drawing board with law enforcement, with a number of different stakeholders that included the mayor's office, the public defender's office, and community voices. And we came up with a working group. And that working group essentially had a slow deliberation. And that working group worked together for, again, over a year. And that group came up with the legislation that was passed out of City Council today. But what we did was we actually introduced the new version of the bill last June. And we did that prior to council ending, and we spent the entire summer listening, talking, and engaging constituents across the city of Philadelphia, educating them about the bill before it was passed into law. So it was several steps as it relates to the process, from analyzing the problem, conceptualizing multiple means of solutions, bringing the right people to the table to work together to come up with a happy medium, something that we can all agree upon, and then also creating what we feel like will be an opportune timeline as it relates to when this bill would be passed and implemented as law. So that's the short version of motor vehicle code legislation that was passed out of City Council yesterday. I want to say thank you for the opportunity to talk briefly about this legislation, and I can answer any questions if anyone has any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Council Member. I'm going to now welcome everyone to come on camera and join me here. We have a lot of questions. Again, I'm Charles T. Brown. I'll be facilitating today's conversation. I want to start with a question that's much more personal than professional. Cara got to this earlier about, you know, this sort of emotional triggers, the grind. Councilmember Thomas just talked about a year-long process. You know, one would wonder, why take on this work? Personally, why did you choose this work to take on? You could have been focused on anything else, but you chose this work. Why? Go ahead, Mike. All right, anyone who is off of mute, go ahead.
There we go. Okay.
Right.
I think for me and for us here in Kansas City, I think it was because this work is really kind of integral to our mission of trying to create a culture of active living in Kansas City. I firmly believe, and my colleagues firmly believe, that we can't possibly push in that direction if we are not working to also break down the barriers beyond, you know, the interventions on the street. And so I think for me personally, the reason why this mattered is because I live in a neighborhood and I live on a street where we don't have sidewalks. And so the possibility of being given a ticket or worse because of something that I didn't have any control over, you know, really pushed me to action, because it's not just about me, it's about people who look like me. It's about my two daughters who deserve to be able to walk in their city without the threat of being over policed for trying to navigate a system that wasn't designed for them to be able to walk.
Go ahead, others. Just jump in.
I mean, I ask myself that question often. It's not easy. It's a very taxing process. But for me, I think the importance of the lives we feel like we'll save. I think when you're talking about these are issues that don't necessarily dominate the news waves. They're not issues that people always put at the forefront, especially when you look at some of the conditions that this coronavirus crisis has created. A lot of these issues that folks like myself and other people on the panel right now have been advocating and fighting for have fallen to the wayside because of so many other issues that have surfaced. So I think an important reason why I do the work, and I'll bet other folks on the panel will probably agree, is because we feel like we have to sustain the heartbeat of this important level of advocacy. If this advocacy isn't happening, and if we're not doing the work, these issues fall by the wayside, we know that they impact the quality of life of every day, not just Philadelphians, but people all across this country. And so we almost feel obligated to a certain extent, because we know that without this level of advocacy, specifically for me, around traffic stops and traffic violations and how they disproportionately impact people of color, someone could lose their life. There's been plenty of examples. We've all seen at least some viral video at some point in your life of simple minor traffic violation turning into something negative happening to an unarmed Black man. So that's the, I guess that's why we do it. And I think every once in a while you get a victory, and it's somewhat rewarding. But then you realize you got to get back to work, because it just doesn't stop. I know for me, this legislation is also going to be about tracking. There's going to be a certain level of transparency that's going to be required as it relates to data around stops in the city of Philadelphia. And that data has never been readily available. So we can continuously assess the data and figure out what do we need to do to reimagine and rethink how do we better serve the citizens of Philadelphia. It's 2021. At some point, as government, we're going to have to act like it.
I'll just share real quick. I think that to an extent, we also felt obligated, but obligated in the sense of I knew this was the right thing to do to end the laws around jaywalking, and for various reasons. Yes, it was, of course, absolutely because of the unequal enforcement and because of the fines associated with that, but across the state, when most of our work has been centered around hosting trainings across the state, and in these trainings, the most consistent thing that has come up over the years are that communities don't have crosswalks where they feel they should. And that is a reason why, in our arguments, we talked about the lack of infrastructure in so many places, and that people are actually forced to jaywalk. So for us, this work is also very, very aligned with what we've seen across the state for many years.
Excellent. We have so many questions too, and we have about 18 minutes remaining. I want you all to try to get through the questions as quickly as you can, and I'll try to ask them as quickly as I can. One thing that comes up often is people feel people are reacting to George Floyd. Councilmember Thomas, you touched on this. I say it in every talk I do on transportation equity, racial equity, that I've been doing this work pre-George Floyd. Why was it important, Councilman Thomas, for you to point that out?
I'll be as brief as possible. Is because people think just what you said, that this is a response to George Floyd. I know for me, when you're talking about motor vehicle code violations and traffic stops in the city of Philadelphia, for me, this is something I've been going through my entire life. I'm 37 years old. I got my driver's license at 16, and I've been pulled over for more times than years I've been driving. And if you talk to some of my white counterparts, they'll tell you that they have more traffic violations than I do, and yet they don't have the same lived experience as I do, while they're more likely to be found with the illegal weapon and or some level of contraband. So that tells you right there that there's an issue. We also have to look at it through a number of different lenses, because we do know sometimes as a society, we're very reactive and we're very emotional in the moment. But this definitely is not one of those cases. We worked very hard on this issue. And again, this was something that we were advocating for since I began my journey as a candidate for city council. And it took me 10 years to win this seat. So it's been a long journey.
Last question before I go to the chat here. Many of you have stated often, I've heard one population over and over, and that's the Black population. But I've also heard communities of color, people of color over and over. Who's really suffering here as it relates to the disparities in the ways in which the jaywalking laws have been enforced? Is it indeed the entire spectrum, people of color, or is it Black people? What is your data telling you?
So the available data that we were able to get in Kansas City, which was, I will say, is narrow in scope, only broke down by Black or white people. So we're frankly not able to say one way or another, in part because the police here didn't give us a full scope. So it was The majority of it was Black people, and there was 4% that were unknown. So that's not to say that it doesn't impact other population, but we know for sure in Kansas City that there was a disparity between white and Black pedestrians receiving jaywalking tickets.
Thank you. What about in California?
It's Black people. And we get that data from the California Racial and Identity Profiling Act, or RIPA. My understanding is that we don't have data from the entire state through that source, but from that source, from the available data, it's Black people.
What about in Philly?
I hate to go 3 for 3 on this one, but it's Black people, and it's actually Black men. When you're talking about our legislation around driving equality, Black men are disproportionately pulled over. I'm in a city that Black people make up about 45% of the population. For some reason, Black folks are well over 70% of the traffic stops in the city of Philadelphia, and that's disproportionately Black men. And so, again, we analyzed the year where we've seen over 300,000 traffic stops, and less than 1% of the time contraband or a weapon was actually found. And the majority of those people who were searched were people of color. So that is something that has disproportionately impacted the Black community. It does impact all communities of color more than non-communities of color, but Black men have been targeted more than any other demographic.
Thank you. Let's go now to question number 1. Let's see if we can get through these. They stated, we are working on legislation to decriminalize jaywalking, but our city told us it's unconstitutional for the city to do so. That is a requirement for our state constitution to have a uniform traffic code. Have you seen any creative ways to get past this barrier? We are willing to pursue at state level, but think our likelihood of success is much lower. Anyone want to touch on that quickly?
I can touch on that really quickly. So what they're talking about is a legislative element that's known as preemption. And this is something that we've seen in both Missouri and Kansas. I will say really briefly, Kansas has a similar element with regards to larger communities as it relates to jaywalking, something related to the uniform traffic code. The short version is, at least as far as we know at this point, is that if the state says that you can't do something, you can go further than it in Kansas, but you can't go less than. So there has to be something on jaywalking. So we're still trying to figure out how to move forward on that.
Great, I think that sufficiently answers that. There was a question about, is there any statewide jaywalking laws in California and or at the federal level? We know that there were, which is why you all had the bill in California. So we'll go on to the next question. Any fees, fines, etc. for tickets need to be limited to a percentage of the cited person's income. So when we talk about fees and fines and reimagining that, do you all think it should be limited to a person's income?
You should be getting rid of them all entirely. I think, and this is coming from someone who was in Missouri, and the Ferguson report I mentioned earlier specifically showed that Ferguson was relying on these fines as a revenue source. So I can certainly understand the benefit of trying to move towards like a sliding scale, but the ultimate goal should be trying to make the streets safer so that someone doesn't have to engage in what we call jaywalking to begin with.
I've heard the gender perspective come up here, and I'm curious to hear from my friend from California here. But they stated, who is looking at safety from assault for girls and women when walking? They state that girls and women of all races are the most endangered walkers. You want to touch on that?
That's a really good question. I could tell you that specifically when, for example, when we analyze data that is through the state, we do, right now it's limited to 2 genders, but we do have some of that data in terms of crashes, but we don't have data when it comes to assault. If the assault data is out there, it's not something that I work with on the day-to-day. I've heard of other organizations who are working on that. And I will say that survivor victim myself, I know that we could be doing a lot more in that area. So thank you.
Excellent. This question is for all of you. Can you talk about the complexity of policing in regards to communities dealing with violence and needing protection, but also being over-policed? So there's concern that if you remove enforcement in an area where there's also crime, how do you deal with the reality now that people may become more vulnerable to, criminal acts in that community? Anyone want to touch on that? Whether or not you considered decriminalizing jaywalking, how it may impact or not crime, because it's usually stated that the stop and frisk were used to deter crime. So what's your response to that?
So I would say that I don't necessarily agree that removing this sort of enforcement necessarily means that you're contributing to more possibility for crime. So especially if some of the crimes that people are concerned about aren't necessarily related to traffic violations. So like if someone is concerned about shootings in a neighborhood, for instance, just because you take away enforcement of jaywalking isn't going to have any impact on how the police react to that instance of violence. So it's important to understand that there are different types of violence, there are different sorts of enforcement, and there are other sorts of interventions which allow you to be able to pump the brakes on one, no pun intended, but also still serve the neighborhood in other ways.
Man, I don't know in my lifetime for communities of color to not be to not be plagued with violence and to not be plagued with crime. So for me, that says that whether we're talking about 300 homicides a year or 600 homicides a year, that those are still the numbers that we're dealing with at least as long as I've been born. And so at the end of the day, whatever it is, as far as the police presence that we have and that's going on, that clearly doesn't work. Number one. Number two, I never blame police for gun violence. I don't see police as the folks who pull the triggers. I don't see them as the ones who deny resources to communities of color or assure that we have these failing institutions as it relates to some of our schools. I don't blame them for that. I only want police to solve a crime once it happens. And in the year 2021, it always ceases to amaze me that we think that the best way to solve a crime is by randomly approaching people that we never met because somehow, some way they look guilty, and to put ourselves in a position where we're going to violate their rights to see if our hunch was on point. You're not even from this neighborhood. So if we were going to go with that strategy, let's at least get somebody that knows the people in that neighborhood. From an ideological perspective, I don't understand why or how people think that that means of policing actually work. Again, it's 2021. We're looking at other means of enforcement, right? Because at the end of the day, when a law is broken and a crime is committed, I think everybody wants to see some level of justice. So how can we reimagine what enforcement looks like as it relates to, in my case in particular, motor vehicle code violations, right? When we have a noise ordinance, do we really want a law officer saying that's too loud? Or is that a great time to be able to use technology and say that it went over a certain volume and automatically scan that person's license plate and registration and have a ticket be sent to them in the mail, right? Like there's a lot of different ways we can reimagine what enforcement looks like as it relates to using technology or different means and mechanisms when we see something that has a direct impact on public safety. But we have to have an honest conversation, and that's what I try to do with folks. When you talk to our law enforcement and they talk about issues around hit and runs, because that's another issue that we're working on, they talk about the need to invest in technology. When we talk about what happens with gun violence and gun crimes, look, a lot of that we're seeing as far as increases in the city of Philadelphia, these are young people who aren't even old enough to drive. So this idea that we have to randomly pull people over and have some level of suspicion in our gut to decide whether or not we should search their car, I mean, clearly it's not working. We need to be more specific and intentional in what we do, and nothing in my bill will have a negative impact on public safety because it doesn't impact things like probable cause or driving intoxicated or driving recklessly or anything like that. We looked at 7 minor infractions, such as things that impair your vision that might be dangling from the window, such as one tail light being out and things of that capacity. So
thank you, Council. California, going back to California, what reasons did the Governor Newsom give for vetoing the bill? What was the reason or reasons?
So his main concern that he shared in his veto letter was that upon reviewing statewide analysis, which again, what we use in California, it's called SWITRs, he quoted that in a 5-year period, 30% of pedestrian crashes were, of 30% of pedestrian crashes, 63% were deemed pedestrian at fault. So there's the rhetoric of blaming the victim, and also that's part of the reason why in our response we also wanted to bring light to the fact that the data is also limited in that it's police reported data, and it's based on their views of who is entitled to the road, because it's still very, very car centric. So he based it on data, and he based it on data that we believe is problematic. It's not holistic.
Excellent. We have about 2 more questions here. You all have stated, I've heard a number of times, discussions of coalition building, principally non-governmental organizations. Have any of you seen quickly state or city DOTs working on this issue with you or separately or both?
Not in Kansas City.
California?
No.
Philly?
Yes, we are working with a state partner who has a mirroring legislation to be able to try to take this same legislation to Harrisburg.
Excellent. Next question for you is, a lot of people are, so there's a mention about decriminalization, which is, let me go to that. They state, in my neck of the woods, this person is coming from Washington, D.C., decriminalization generally just means that the activity goes from being a crime to being a civil violation. So there can still be tickets, use of violation in civil suits, etc. So jaywalking was decriminalized here decades ago, but it is still not legal, and people still get tickets and still get blamed. It sounds like Kansas City actually legalized jaywalking. Is that right?
So jaywalking is out of the municipal code. There is some language that specifically, so the way that it was written was that it was basically you can't cross anywhere that's not the crosswalk. That part is gone. You can now do that. The police more or less pushed for the inclusion of language that says that you cannot like intentionally jump in front of a car or something like that. But I mean, in terms of specifically of it still like being a violation of a civil violation to cross at some point other than a crosswalk, that is no longer the case.
So in Oregon, every intersection is legally defined as a crosswalk. Would this help reduce jaywalking stops and arrests?
I'd like to answer that. In California, every intersection, unless there's a no crossing sign, is a legal crosswalk. And one of the things that we wanted to highlight, or that we did highlight throughout this process, is that in Sacramento, in I want to say it was 2017, someone, a Nandi Kane Jr., was beaten by Sacramento police when he was crossing in an unmarked crosswalk. And I think that that's part of the reason why we have to actually decriminalize all of jaywalking, because even when people are even when Black men are crossing where they legally should be, cops still don't understand the law. So I feel you, Oregon. We have the same thing happening over here.
Excellent. Give me your final thoughts and takeaways. What's next for each of you, starting with you, council member? What's next?
Oh, thank you for having me. Next for me is the component of the bill that talks about the level of transparency that has to happen with stops, assuring that we monitor the process and make sure that we essentially got it right. When you do something as big and as historic as this, is a certain level of tracking that must go with it as it relates to analyzing the data and putting us in a position to continue to work with law enforcement, right? This was a collaborative effort. So we did work with law enforcement. We did work with the mayor, the administration, and other members of council, and that's going to be our goal moving forward. So thank you, Charles. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I appreciate the conversation. And
what made you, I'm curious, was that your call? Whose call was it to work with law enforcement on this?
Me, yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the goal is to get something done, and if I have the opportunity to work with law enforcement and put together a quality coalition, we definitely want to do that. So it was my idea, but I mean, they had to be open to the invitation, and I appreciate our Commissioner of Philadelphia, Commissioner Outlaw, our Mayor Kenny, and my colleagues on council, because it was definitely a collaborative effort. This is something that passed 14-2 and 15-1, so it wasn't done in isolation.
Excellent. Let's go to California, then Kansas City.
So like I mentioned, we just found out a week ago about the veto. So I think the next steps are we just need to get our core team together. We need to connect with the author's office. And the next step is that the governor's office wants to meet with us, but we need clarity on what that means and what is the purpose of that.
Please keep us all informed so we can support you, okay? Mike?
Yes, thank you again for inviting me. Thanks to Caro and Councilmember Thomas for his remarks, and for Dr. Brown for moderating. I'll say that, again, our work in Kansas City is focusing first on developing the how-to guide, and we're excited to work with the Safe Routes Partnership to develop that. But again, our work is also going to be working on trying to identify the additional ways that we can really kind of reduce the need for traffic enforcement, not just in Kansas City, but in the other big portions of our region. Because again, it really isn't something that's limited to Kansas City. There's an opportunity for communities of all sizes to make a move towards creating more equitable, safe spaces for people to be able to safely walk. So thank you again.
Thank each of you. You're truly, dynamic individuals, individually and collectively. And I always appreciate the times that we have an opportunity to discuss this. I know we can go all day if we had time, but I want to turn it over to Kelsey now to close us out. Thank you, everyone.
Wow, thank you all so much for your presentations and this awesome conversation. And thank you, Charles, for the outstanding moderation of this topic with all of the great questions that came in today. People did, I want to say, resoundingly told us in the chat that they really appreciated the practical takeaways, but also the very candid pieces of this discussion, especially in calling attention to the intense emotional labor of this work. So thank you very much. And we just want to thank our sponsors again. If you did enjoy today's discussion, please consider playing a part in keeping more content like this coming your way by making a small donation. We suggest $15 to $20 if you can swing it, but anything helps and really goes a long way towards extending and improving this work. So please also keep a lookout for the survey link, so you can tell us exactly what you thought of this webinar. We really do value and pay attention to your feedback on this. And join us next month in November. We have transportation advocacy that centers voices of people with disabilities and non-drivers. So a final date and time for this webinar will be announced and sent out to you all soon. Just want to thank you all again. Thank you to our guests and their precious time today. It really means a lot. Have a great day, everyone, and we will see you soon.